Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Dr. Jan Meij. I'm this year's director for the Office of Public Policy Events, and I'm also a sociologist in the Department of Justice Studies. And as such, I'm wearing two hats. We started the Office of Public Policy Events last year, and we held four events of this, and we started with a civility summit, where different representatives from the university reaffirmed their commitment to civil discourse. And so when we discussed this year's programming, we thought it was a great idea to now maybe we do this as an annual event. Each year, right, we welcome new students, we welcome new staff, we welcome new faculty, we welcome new members in the community. If you followed the news on campus last week, the Board of Trustees and the Faculty Senate reaffirmed their commitment to civil discourse, and this is a continuation of that event. And so I just want to say a few things about the importance of civil discourse, both as a representative of the university and in my other hat as a faculty member. So we often see conflict as something that is negative. And that's actually a short-sighted perspective. A lot of positive can come from conflict. Let me just give you one example. The university, right? We are historically a place where difficult conversations can be had, and in fact, we probably are one of the last spaces where people can civilly engage with one another across difference. And I'm sure you can think of some very contentious issues that people disagree on, but there are some very meaningful ones, right? Let's just consider what is happening here in Southwest Florida. We're in the midst of hurricane season, right? You've all heard about the challenges of red tide. You're probably aware that we are one of the fastest growing populations in the nation. And so with that comes challenges, right? People need places to live. The university just became the first in the state university system to offer, is going to build affordable housing for its employees, right? That's a challenge. That's a priority that we have to do. Without civil discourse, looking from different representatives, what to prioritize. Do we focus on economic growth? Do we focus on environmental protection? So civil discourse is important. Then as a faculty member, I always find it amusing when I see some people describe academia as this monolithic entity, that all academics agree with one another. If you think that, I welcome you to one of our faculty meetings. I welcome you to our professional conferences. I welcome you to our scholarly journals. There's a lot of critical engagement. We've got to hear from people that have different perspectives. So in the classroom, this is true as well. My goal as an educator is telling students how to think, not what to think. And so you got to expose people to different viewpoints and have them decide what the right positions are. There are very few political positions I can think of that are not rooted somewhat in a factual basis. And so there's a space to do that. This is perhaps also especially important in a time where we hear a lot about polarization. And you know, for the most part, that is a media-created sentiment, but we're also entering into, you know, a relatively contentious couple of weeks when we're going to go to the polls and elect the next president. There are terms that you've probably heard about: misinformation and disinformation. And you know, misinformation means I unintentionally share false information. The key word here is unintentionally. To me, the promise of civil discourse is to address this misinformation concept. Disinformation means I intentionally share false information. Most of us have probably engaged one way or another in misinformation, and we've probably acknowledged that when we were confronted with it. Yeah, civil discourse matters to the university. It matters to faculty. I also wanted you to hear from a student. When we were discussing the programming, I met Rayna, who was, and I asked her, what made you interested in civil discourse? And I thought it was a good opportunity to have her do that. So thank you. And Rayna, it's your.
Hello, my name is Rayna Smith. This is my third year studying communication here at FGCU. I'm so excited, and I think it's so wonderful that all of you have gathered here today to engage in us and welcoming Dr. Nolan. And I'm just very excited to see what comes of this center and what comes of this community and what comes of these meetings. But pertaining to that question specifically, I've kind of growing up always been pegged as a sort of assertive and sometimes argumentative person, and it's a strength and a weakness, and I think it's something that boldness is something that I think we should all try to engage more in. I know that it does take quite a bit of bravery sometimes to do that, and I think it's something that's worth stepping out of your comfort zone and doing and engaging with, and I'm just so excited that we have this space on this campus to do so. And I think it's wonderful that that we have such amazing guest speakers that have the experience with educated and well-crafted arguments and can gift us with nuggets of wisdom of how we can maybe engage in civil discourse in a better, more civil way. And I don't think that civil necessarily means complacent. I think that sometimes people get into this kind of people-pleasing mindset and are afraid to engage with other people and are afraid to kind of express their disagreements, but those disagreements are healthy as long as they're expressed in a very respectful and educated way. So I'm excited to kind of disagree, I guess, with some of you guys, but thank you.
All right, so next, the reason why you're all here, Dr. Higdon. I put the URL on there. We're using poll everywhere. Please go to that website right now, and throughout his talk, throughout our Q&A, you can submit questions. If you see me rudely staring at my laptop, it's to see what questions you have. And so I want to integrate the questions you have with the questions that I have prepared. So, so please go to that website on your phone, and I'd love to see your questions. And floor is all yours.
Cool. All right, thank you very much for that introduction. Appreciate that. My name is Dr. Nolan Higdon, and I'm visiting you from University of California, Santa Cruz. And it's been a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Dr. Jan Meij for hosting me and bringing me around. Also, it's Dr. Meij's birthday today, so I think we all need to say happy birthday. All right, just making sure. Okay. Appreciated meeting Lynn Milner and Glenn Miller as well. Thank you very much for having me in your courses and the whole campus community here at Florida Gulf University. It's been a pleasure, and I really appreciate it. Thank you all for showing up as well on a Friday. Appreciate you coming out. And I decided to put this at the front of my talk because I always mean to put it at the end and I always forget. But for folks, if you are interested in my work, you can. There are things you can purchase, but instead of spending money, I give away my work for free on Substack, and I would, appreciate if you could sign up for that. It's absolutely free. I give everything for free, and just give you an idea of the stuff I do. Recently, I just published a resource guide on fake news around the election. I try to keep it to like once every couple weeks. I send something so I don't blow up your email box, but during election season, probably about once a week. I'll be sending out something. So you can find me on Substack there. And in addition, I'll also put some of the social media stuff up as well for folks who may want to connect online. All right, those will be the last nice things I say about social media. All right, so I'm here today as those great opening remarks from Rayna and Dr. Meij illustrated. We are here in election year, and conflict is a good thing. When done well, when done constructively, conflict can be a good thing. But in the United States in 2024, we see signs of destructive conflict. We see multiple assassination attempts on candidates. We see viable threats against Supreme Court justices. We see political violence on college campuses and in places like the home of the Speaker of the House in the Bay Area where I'm from. People storming the Capitol. We see hateful ideologies in our discourse about politics. Polls show that Americans' number one fear is other Americans. More than terrorism, more than climate change, we're afraid of each other. Support for censorship is at an all-time high. I know this, I do a lot of these public talks, and just over the last 5-6 years, the first time in my life where someone has raised their hand and said, so what's the problem with censorship? Or don't you think there should be some limits on the First Amendment? We're starting to hear these things more and more. And they come coupled with baseless conspiracies that we are constantly addressing, like immigrants eating pets, or Russians controlling elections, or rigged elections and rigged debates, et cetera, et cetera. The point I'm trying to make to you here is these are not signs of a thriving democracy. These are signs of a democracy that has some serious problems. And for those who are interested in what a democracy is a political system for choosing leaders and making policy, and ideally these are fair elections. Democracies typically value human rights. Democracies typically have civic participation and some rule of law. This is what a democracy is. And as you'll hear me talk about today, my big political bias is I am for democracy. That's the bias I bring to you from California, my pro-democracy stance. But as I mentioned there, it's been a rough time for democracy around the globe and in the United States as well. Scholars have documented what they see as a weakening of United States democracy. And to be honest, a lot of this discourse about democracy really amplified during the Trump era, but it started before that. The famous studies from 2014 about scholars determining that the United States was more like an oligarchy. Some folks have called it inverted totalitarianism. And I think the Democracy Index now has us, the United States, classified as a flawed democracy. So that's what we're classified at this point in time. Eric Lundgren and Mark Blythe, they refer to the current economic and political structure of the United States as angrynomics. We are angry and filled with rage, and we take it out on each other at the ballot box. That's what motivates our voting and participation. What I've argued in my work over the years, and what I'm here to talk to you all about today, is the critical role that media and politicians play in creating this very divisive environment that is threatening our democracy. The media and political class have taught us too often to hate and fear one another rather than listen, understand, and collaborate with each other. Now, news media, this is not the reason why a news media exists in a democracy. A news media is in a democracy for a multitude of very important reasons. One, a good news media should give us a public record of what is going on. It should be a marketplace of ideas. It should be an agenda setter. It should be an information disseminator. And I think most importantly, it's supposed to hold the powerful accountable. There's a famous 19th century line from a play about how a good news media system comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. That's what a good media system is supposed to do. But today, that's not the case. We see poll after poll and survey after survey showing how uninformed Americans are on basic things about what's going on in their democracy. The free press is protected by the First Amendment with the sole purpose for making sure that doesn't happen, and they have largely failed in that regard. They rely on a red versus blue framing of all issues, which is helpful in some regard when it's Democrats versus Republicans, but not everything is a red-blue issue. Sometimes the Republicans and Democrats agree. Sometimes people outside the Democrats and Republicans hate what the Democrats and Republicans agree on, but those voices are often invisibilized, not talked about in our current media structure. And the concern there is it gives us the impression that everything is a red versus blue division, that everything is a divide, that these team red and team blue are simply irredeemable. We cannot ever work with these folks. They're the opposite of who we are. And we see this consistently in these bubbles. One of my favorite examples is during COVID. Studies show that if you were getting a heavy diet of conservative media, you dramatically underestimated the amount of people who died from COVID. That same study also showed that if you were relying on liberal news, you dramatically overestimated the amount of people that died from COVID. Those are illustrations of how our media system have certain bias, and it frames the ways in which people see the world. And why this red-blue frame is really problematic. It'd be much better to get your news from the conservatives and the liberals and make an accurate determination of what actually happened during COVID. Now, this process is decades in the making. Starting around the 1980s with the advent of cable news, things changed. Prior to the advent of cable news outlets tried to get the largest audience possible. One commentator said that the goal of Walter Cronkite was to make sure the racist uncle and the teenager in the Che shirt were both watching the program at the same time. That is, they wanted to get audiences left, right, and center to watch the program. Cable news changed that. It gave more options, which fragmented audiences. And Fox News pioneered the idea of finding one demographic, older white conservatives, and feeding them information that would keep them tuned in. And what Fox figured out, that pro wrestling had honestly figured out 40 years earlier, was that if you convince your audience to cheer for the good guy, in that case Republicans, and boo the bad guy, Democrats, they'll tune in. They'll tune in every week. They can't wait to hear and see the next horrible thing the Democrat did and how the Republicans are going to beat him, win him over. It was only a matter of time before MSNBC adopted this in a pro-Democrat form. CNN would jump on board. And then we got the internet, which further fragmented audiences. And things like social media do the same thing. They appeal to people's bias with content to keep them on their screen, confirm that bias, and make you hate and fear enemies, both real and imagined, but characters of them nonetheless. So media has not really helped us, but I want to make it very clear, as I pointed out in the beginning, journalism is a key part of a democracy. We need a thriving journalistic class, and we do have really great journalists who do excellent work within this country. Unfortunately, a lot of the well-paying or prestigious jobs within media necessitate using this red-blue frame or hyper-divisive content to further your career. And we know this from things like the Dominion lawsuit. Dominion was a company that sued Fox News for lying and saying that Dominion helped steal the election from Trump. As part of that lawsuit, we got some text messages, and we found out that Fox personalities admitted to themselves and each other that the election was not stolen, but that their audience wanted to believe it was stolen. So they were going to keep hosting guests who said the election was stolen, even though they knew themselves that it was not. That's how the bias works right there. That's how the careerism plays a role for a lot of these folks. Now, we've been saying this for years, those of us who are critical of news media. The Dominion lawsuit was just a gift. It was very irrefutable evidence of how much the desire to build your audience and your audience's bias shapes the content that you produce. But media are hardly the only ones to blame here. As I mentioned before, we also have a political class that feeds into this. They reap political benefits from these divisive narratives. And I'm thinking of things like when politicians say things like real America, implying that there's a fake America and fake Americans. Calling folks basket of deplorables, calling folks weird, chance of lock her up, chance of lock him up. Mislabeling political views as communist, fascist, terrorist, spreading fear that democracy is on the ballot, or we must stop the steal, or we must take our country back. This is really aggressive, unproductive rhetoric that further divides the country and spreads fear. And it was in this environment that Mickey Huff and I decided to work on Let's Agree to Disagree, which we're here to talk about today. And the goal of this text came from a lot of public talks we had done. So previous to this, I had written a book on the history of fake news, and Mickey had written censored books. And we would always give book talks, and we would get on the phone after our book talks, and we'd share our notes and things like that. And we kept doing these talks where people would say, like, okay, I get it. Fake news has been around forever. It's a problem. There's ways to spot it. But how do I talk to people who believe it? And we kept getting that question at event after event. And so it was the audience who really generated this text that we came up with, Let's Agree to Disagree. And the reason why we liked that title is because we were debating whether or not to have this title. And in the process, we came up with like 10 different interpretations of what Let's Agree to Disagree means. And we liked it because we realized if people had complaints about the book based on the cover and the title, they were literally judging a book by its cover. And so we could use that as a starting point of discussion with folks. And also, I should say, while I was finishing this book, I think it was the first draft we sent into the publisher, I sent in on January 6, 2021. My phone was blowing up with texts. I wasn't paying attention because I was trying to get this draft out to the publisher because I had another project. And then I looked and I said, gosh, I guess this is like the most timely thing we've ever written, literally on this day of storming the Capitol. Now, the text itself is separated into three main parts that we're going to talk about here tonight, but I want to draw your attention to a couple things. We start out the text talking about the importance of dialogue. So the first two up there, create constructive dialogue and reflect on communication practices. That's part one of the book. What we want to do in that section is talk about why we need to have dialogue with people we disagree with in a democracy. And let's remember, democracy is a 24-hour-a-day job. That's the radical idea of democracy, that we as the people are going to make critical decisions about our country, its future, policies, and more. That means if someone believes something that's false, or someone is behaving in a way that I think threatens my democracy, it is my job, your job, all of our jobs to try and correct the record. That strengthens our democracy. And so we have to be able to have those conversations with people we disagree with. But not all conversations are the same. Dr. Meij talked about the importance of conflict a moment ago. It's okay to have disagreements with folks, but it's not okay to let those disagreements become destructive. When we're doing things like name calling or making fun of each other or blocking each other or trying to censor each other or wishing people never were born and disappeared, that's very destructive. And it loses sight of what your goal is in a democracy. In a democracy, my goal is to convince you. Use evidence. Please support this policy. Please take this position. Please understand that I'm correct in this side. You're not going to do that if you shame people and you make fun of them and you label them away. Conversely, also in a democracy, we need to learn. I don't know everything. Far from it. I've got a wife who reminds me of that. I don't know anything. Either do other folks. So you want to listen, always hold in the back of your head that you don't know everything. And even if somebody seemingly is saying something insane, maybe there's some nugget in there of something for you to learn. So be patient, be respectful, be decent to one another. Then we talked about what to actually do in these conversations. And that's the I and the T up there, the inquire and the test theory and ideology. We try and encourage folks to be more critical thinkers, to let the evidence dictate their conclusions. So try to always go back to the evidence. Sometimes there just is no evidence. And in those cases, it's best just to suspend judgment rather than speculate, because speculation can easily turn into false information. Give you a prime example. I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to jump on social media moments after the first Trump assassination attempt, but I was stunned how many people had already figured out everything that had happened that day, even though they were nowhere near Butler, Pennsylvania. It was an inside job. It was a false flag. Trump did it. There was no shooter, et cetera, et cetera. All that speculation does is further send out more false or baseless information into people's information ecosystem. Sometimes we just need to suspend judgment. Other times, those critical thinkers, we want to take that evidence. We want to see what conclusions we can draw. And we want to admit some things are not factually based. They're widely held belief systems, such as ideologies. Things that are passed around as normal, but aren't necessarily based in any truth or fact. So, and something like theory is a good way to understand ideology. So a theory, when we talk about theory outside of academia, we sort of say things dismissively, right? Like, oh, that's just your theory. It's a conspiracy theory. Good theory means that you see something as a researcher, something happening over and over again. And then you take the evidence and you test a theory and you test it and retest it and refine it. And other people test it and refine it. And once that happens, it becomes an accepted theory. Ideology is very different. Ideology is, this is the way the world should be. So now we're going to work backward and tell you what we need to make the world that way. We all have different ideologies. We all have different ways we think the world should be. We have different views on how we think they should be accomplished. It's good to tease those out in discussions. It's not even sometimes that someone's necessarily wrong or that we have a fundamental disagreement about the facts. It's just they see the world a different way. And theory can be very helpful in understanding that. And I can explain a little bit more about how to use theory. And then we end the book talking about the importance of media and how to be more responsible media users, how to recast ourselves as media citizens instead of media consumers. We don't want to be mindless consumers who consume news and journalism for entertainment. We use news and journalism for the purpose of informing ourselves so we can be a better participant in our democracy. That's what you're doing when you sit down on your screen, for example. But if you start sharing stuff that you haven't investigated, or just because you like the headline, or just because you want it to be true, you may be a serious problem, a serious part of the fake news problem when you're doing things like that. Digital media did not start this crisis, as I noted, but it has complicated it. And there are a lot of things we can do in the digital environment to be more responsible. One thing in particular, I don't care whatever your number one issue is, whatever you think is the most important issue that you and we as a country should be dealing with. I'm sorry to say, I don't think social media is a good place to discuss it. I don't think you're going to accomplish any serious progress on that issue by arguing about it on social media. Social media is a lot of things. Social is not one of them. It's not really built as a place where we're able to communicate in a constructive way. So we talk about that. We talk about alternatives. We talk about things that folks can do to limit their digital footprint, ways they can try and expand the ideological bias of content that they're looking at. These can be seemingly small things, like just doing digital declutter. Look at all the accounts you have. What do you actually need? Or just keep a journal of how often you check your phone. See how much control it has over you. Are you using it, or is it using you? I also like pro and con lists. I do this with my students. Write a pro list and a con list of your social media use. Do the good outweigh the bad, or does the bad outweigh the good? Can you justify using social media? One thing I don't do is tell people what to do. If you want to use social media, great. If you don't, that's great too. It's up to you to decide your relationship with it. I don't believe we should be authoritarians telling you to use it or not use it. And so lastly, we close the book with a message that democracy is not a spectator sport. You need to get involved. Like I said, it's a 24-hour-a-day job. It necessitates us trying to inform ourselves, trying to participate in democracy. Like I always say for folks though, if that seems like a lot of work and you feel like, oh, I just don't have the energy to participate in my democracy 24 hours a day, you're in luck. There's a lot of authoritarian regimes looking for lazy, passive people who just want to take orders. But if you want a democracy, it's going to necessitate us all participating. Up here on the screen, I'm providing some of the free resources and places I highly recommend to improve media usage and media diet. And I look forward to our discussion here today and getting some questions from all of you. In closing, I'll just say, democracy is the worst system, except for all the rest. Thank you.
All right. I'm already seeing some good questions coming in that I will integrate. Also, I forgot to mention at the beginning, there's QR codes. Our library has unlimited access to the book, and I highly recommend checking it out. There's lots of questions and resources in it, so make sure to scan it if you want to do that. So I'm going to start with a simple question that, or maybe it's not, a question about, was there a time when you interacted with somebody you disagreed with initially that changed your perspective? And what made you change your perspective?
Yeah, great question. I think for personally, yeah, it's happened to me a lot. And I think that's probably true of everyone in here, right? You've been presented with new evidence that changed your view on some particular topic. For me, yeah, it happens all the time. Sometimes it might not even be dispelling a myth, but just expanding my understanding of a particular topic. I was given the example of a couple of weeks ago. I was having a discussion about the immigrants eating pets story. And as part of the discussion, though, we were talking about how the news media frames issues of immigration. And the person, I gave my analysis of how I think the news media frames it, and they pushed back on one point and said, but yeah, like they never talk about sort of infrastructure issues and taxpayer bases with population increases. And I just thought that was an interesting thing I had not considered in my whole analysis. And so it made me think I need to do a better job of having a more holistic look at how I discuss this topic. And so it wasn't a divisive thing at all. The person just corrected me, and it was something I immediately took in. But I think I've had so many of those type of situations. And I think that's the right way to be, is to expect to learn and be clear that we don't know everything. So during your talk, you mentioned about how, you know, there should never be censorship, that free speech is important. So that makes me wonder, if we love free speech, is civil discourse always connected to that? Are there particular topics that can be discussed in a civil manner? Say the last part of the question.
Yeah. Are there topics that can be discussed in a civil manner? Yeah, I think anything can be discussed in a constructive or civil manner if the parties involved want to be reciprocal and treat it that way. Sometimes it's not easy. I mean, there are things that I'm sure everybody in this room deeply cares about, and to hear someone speak about them negatively might sometimes blind us to the constructive side of the discussion. But I think the reason why free speech is so critical to having civil dialogue is we have to be able to say what we think without fear of reprisal. We can't let chilling effect silence folks. If we do that, we lose ideas, we lose critical perspectives. It becomes too easy for the majority to silence minority views without something like unchained free speech. And I also push back on this area. So let's say we worked in this room right now and we were going to create a list of things that we think are just unacceptable and they should not be a part of speech in the United States of America in 2024. I'm sure we could probably make a pretty good list, right? And maybe agree in a lot of areas. But then I would ask a more controversial question. Who do you trust to censor that content?
The government, with its history, big tech, corporations, me. Anyway, so the whole idea there is that censorship complicates fake news problems. It empowers someone or some group to be able to censor content. And most of the people, or most of the groups that you would choose to censor content, they have a history involved in fake news in themselves. Look at corporate America. The sugar industry for years lied to us with fake studies that said that sugar wasn't the problem with people's health. The fossil fuel industry denied climate change, even though its own studies said it was humans were responsible for it. The U.S. government, my God, they've been running propaganda campaigns as for the whole 20th and 21st century. So if you give them the power to censor, I imagine what they're going to do with it is use it to censor out any content that calls out their false information. So then you've just complicated the problem. You haven't solved it. So I've never been a big fan of censorship for that reason. There is obviously tons of ideas and perspectives and words I would love to see erased, but no one's ever given me a good foolproof plan on how to do that while also maintaining freedom and liberty.
So that kind of connects to a question that came in from the audience that how does one balance objectivity and open-mindedness with their passion, subjectivity in a subject, and all the topics that you mentioned, and before immigration being one. I mean, the January 6th riot. In the media literacy class, we spoke about the Cosmo Pizza shooting, where the guy generally thought there were kids being held against their will. I mean, pedophilia. I mean, there's very few people, and I would hope no one in this room would defend pedophilia. And so, I mean, that's a genuine concern, and so a genuine passion, right? I mean, if you really think that the election was rigged, then going to January 6th, there's passion. So how do you combine that with objectivity?
Are you talking about at a personal level, or when you speak to other folks? Like, how do I maintain my own objectivity or others?
Both. I think both, if I interpret the question.
Okay. Oh, that's right. You're reading somebody else's question. Yeah. Sorry. It's my first time here. As far as just to start with about objectivity, I don't think we can ever achieve objectivity. I think we can strive for it. So getting as close to objective as possible is probably as good as it's going to get in my estimation. I know there are some folks who disagree with me on that, but that's where I stand on that. So at some level, I think we're always going to have some subjectivity. But on a personal basis, one of the things I encourage folks to do is we spend a lot of time waving our finger at other people, right? You're wrong, you believe insane stuff. I would scrutinize myself a lot more. One of the things that media is good at in general, social media in particular though, is confirming existing biases. So when you find content that confirms your bias, that's the stuff I would scrutinize way more than anything else in a social environment. And that can help you get closer to that objectivity range. As far as when I'm talking to someone who holds a false belief, in that I try and meet them on some human level. So I think it's good to recognize their humanity. It's good to recognize something like you pointed out, like, yes, we're both against pedophilia, so I'm not opposed to what you're fighting. But is this mic going out? Was it going out? Is that a little better? Good? Okay. As far as reaching folks who believe things that are false, in those cases, trying to meet them on some human level. Again, I wouldn't call a person out on social media, because when you call them out on social media, the whole world is watching, and a lot of people feel so much pressure from that moment of being on stage that the last thing they want to be seen as wrong or making a mistake or something like that. So they'll defend an indefensible position, largely for that pressure often. It's better to get them in a separate space, even if it's email or something, just out of the public sphere, to chat with them. I like the idea of sticking to questions. I think questions are much more constructive than judgments. And look, I tell this all the time. People who listen to my talks are sick of hearing it, but it's true. Just ask somebody casually, like, oh, I'd never heard that before. Where did you hear that? It can be a really powerful question because it reminds them like, oh, where did I hear that? And what evidence do I have for this? Maybe they have no evidence. In those cases, it can be plant a seed for those folks to realize they need to better look at the evidence for the things they're saying. Also, it always helps to present counter evidence instead of calling someone wrong. Be like, oh, that's really weird because I read this thing on such and such. Maybe I'll send it to you. So get other information into their bubble. So I think it takes a delicate approach. I also think we need to remind ourselves you can't do it all at once. So if you think this person supports a political party that you think is the worst party ever, I doubt you're going to change their mind in a 30-minute discussion. But maybe you can at least open up their mind in a 30-minute discussion and start them on a path where they see some of the things you see about that particular party or one of its positions. So also keep realistic expectations when we enter those as well. And also stop us from being so frustrated with people. Because if you go in expecting to radically change their worldview and fail, people start to get frustrated and angry with the other person.
So a lot of what we're discussing, right, assumes that speakers are acting in good faith. Is civil discourse possible with a bad faith actor, and what are some mechanisms that you can figure out if somebody is speaking out of bad faith?
Yeah, it's a good question. Constructive dialogue necessitates reciprocity. We have to be reciprocal. If I'm going to come to the conversation and respect you as a human, you need to respect me back, or there's nowhere to go from there. We have to have that decency. We also have to have integrity. So mean what we say and say what we mean when we're communicating with one another. And sometimes you can demonstrate that by listening, which I think is very important as well. Listening to people. So it's not that you hear them and you wait for them to stop talking, but you listen and try to understand them, repeat what they said back to them before you comment on it to make sure you heard them correctly in that case. So I think those are some of the mechanisms you can use to create a more constructive environment. But as far as signs, I think we all know what we find inappropriate in conversation, right? At a personal level. Hateful terms, hateful labels, hateful ideologies are warning signs. Sometimes though, the person you're talking to may not even know that they are perpetuating those. So I encourage folks to be as charitable as possible, to try and say like, that's a pretty racist thing to say. Here's why. And give them the opportunity to be reciprocal and say like, oh, you're right. I didn't think of it that way. On the other hand, if you try to set boundaries about words you don't want used or ideas you don't want to express, and the folks you're talking to continue to do it despite the fact you've clearly said it, they're not engaging in a good faith discussion. There's nowhere else for you to go from there. You could kindly tell that person, maybe one day when you're able to listen to me, I'll come back, I want to listen to you. But until then, this is done. So I think having personal boundaries that you communicate and not letting those get crossed is also an important way to set critical frameworks for yourself to be engaged in more constructive dialogue in the future as well.
So that really connects to, you reference in the book, it's truly an amazing story of Daryl Davis. Can you share with the audience a little bit about that story? But then in particular, what are some of the lessons for, because you mentioned the thing you said was racist. What advice do you have for members of marginalized communities about why civil discourse, or how civil discourse is still important, even on those very personally sensitive topics?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would never encourage anyone to take hate at all. I don't think it's constructive. But Daryl Davis is an interesting person because he jumped right into the hate with what he did. And for folks who don't know, Daryl Davis is a African-American civil rights activist who's been active, I think, for about 40 years now or so. But he didn't really start out that way. He was a jazz musician and a really talented one at that. And he had befriended a white person who kept coming to the bar where Daryl would play, and they would talk about music. And at some point in their relationship, this white man communicated to Daryl Davis that he's actually a part of the Ku Klux Klan. And this was the first time he had had a beer with a black man. And Daryl Davis thought that was insane. He's like, "You've never had a beer with a black man." And this guy sort of sheepishly admitted that he wanted to leave the Klan. He was embarrassed, and he wanted to give Daryl his robe. And Daryl, I can only imagine a huge emotional moment on a multiple levels. But Daryl actually saw an opportunity in that. And rather than just take the one robe and stop there, Daryl decided he wanted to go deeper into the Ku Klux Klan. He wanted to see if he could use dialogue with Klan members to get more folks to drop out. I think he reports now to about like 200 robes he's collected in the decade since he's been doing this work. And I mean, this is, one of these situations. He met one of the Grand Masters alone in a hotel room. Daryl Davis did. He was not able to get the Grand Master to change his position, but he was able to get the Grand Master to talk with him for a couple of hours. But yeah, Davis set this tone of how important it was to meet on a human level. He used jazz as a way to find some human connection beyond the racial discourse, and then leverage that into talking deeper about race. Once they'd recognized the humanity in Daryl Davis, Davis was trying to leverage that to get people to see the problems with the Klan. And Mickey and I knew, Mickey and I are both two white guys writing this book. And actually, before the book even came out, people were complaining about that, judging a book by its cover. So we made a point in every single chapter to use examples of folks who have done the work we're discussing, who are not like us. So who are not white men. And Daryl Davis is one of the examples. There's also some, in Maine and Massachusetts, trans activists went door to door to do 30-minute discussions with anti-trans voters to get them to change their vote. They had a academic team follow them around on this, and they were successful in these 30-minute conversations in changing some votes of voters at the ballot box from these conversations. So I know some of the stuff I'm saying sounds theoretical, but one of the things we did in the book, and Daryl Davis is a prime example of, is to show examples of where people are actually doing this work and succeeding. It's not just sort of pie in the sky theoretical stuff.
This fits really well with another audience question. How do you keep your emotions in check when discussing sensitive topics with others?
I'm a sociopath. No. You can never truly keep your emotions in check. Emotions are a good thing. They're part of what it means to be a human being, and all of us have them. And they're not something I would say we need to conceal, but I would always recommend being cognizant of letting the emotions control or blind your critical thinking. If you're so mad about whatever it is, that's probably not a good time to engage in destructive dialogue. Get the blood pressure down a little bit. If you're very sad and you're mourning just terrible things have gone on in your life, probably not a good time to engage in dialogue. Now, if you're in the middle of the conversation and it seems like it's going fine, and then all of a sudden your blood pressure is getting up, or you see the other person's blood pressure is getting up, if it's you, try to de-escalate. If you can't, maybe this conversation has become destructive. Try to de-escalate the other person as much as possible. If you can't, looks like this conversation has become destructive. And I encourage folks to, if you can't de-escalate, exit the communication at that point. We've gone down the wrong path. We need a break, and maybe we can restart later. But whatever we're doing, it's making both of us worse, and in that sense, wasting both of our times. So emotions are necessary, but like anything else, they can get out of control, get the better of us, and contribute to destructive dialogue.
So you mentioned social media earlier, and I agree. I mean, conversations like the one we have here face to face are probably more productive. Is there a way to have civil discourse on social media? And if so, what thoughts would you have about that?
I think it's topic specific. I think we can have civil discourse about, things that don't really go to the core for a lot of people. So we can have civil discourse about how beautiful a picture is, or maybe how much we like a new TV show or something like that. But once we start to get into, I think, contentious issues that are very important to any of the participants in the dialogue, social media it really is not a great place to engage in those conversations. All the incentives in social media platforms are devised to get people to react, not to think. And we need to think when we're talking, especially about contentious issues. We need to be careful on what we say and take the time to articulate it. When we feel like if we don't respond right away, we're somehow, going to look bad in the conversation and we just react, that ends up being problematic. So I think for those reasons, I don't think social media is really conducive to constructive dialogue. And for folks who don't know, the industry, social media that is, they copied a lot of their tricks from the gambling industry. And they have casinos in Las Vegas that are built just for the purpose of monitoring human behavior. To learn more about how humans react to things. So then the platform can use those insights. And the platform is not using those insights to create more constructive dialogue. I want to be very clear. The internet itself could be a million things, and it's a fun thought exercise to think about what would a more democratic social media look like, one that actually promoted democracy. But the one we have is for profit. And the way they make profit is by keeping you on the screen, doing free labor. Everything you do on the internet is free. Their platform's not free because it takes your privacy and it takes your data, and they make a lot of money, but your labor is free. You don't get paid for it. That is given to these companies to maximize their wealth, and the stuff that keeps people on their screen confirms bias, plays to fear, plays to hate, and that's exactly what good fake news does. That's why so many scholars report that it's not that the internet itself is conducive to fake news. Social media platforms, the way they're designed, are designed in a way that privileges fake news over legitimate content. And we've done tons of studies where you send a fake news story out and it spreads to hundreds of thousands, millions of users within a day. You send a correction out, maybe you get like 5,000 users share it that day. The way that the platform is designed privileges that false content. So for that reason, I just think it's really not conducive to constructive dialogue.
So the example from the casino is fascinating, and we hear a lot about the role of artificial intelligence. We've seen the rise of deepfakes. What are some ways that we can resist falling for those types of things? Because a deepfake, it sounds like me, it looks like me, and I can say the most disgusting things, and you see it with your own eyes, right? And we say it like, believe it when you can see it with your own eyes. And so now that's fake. So what are some other ways that we can handle that?
Yeah, Aviva Vadia, who works, I think, computer engineering space, he said in 2015 when he saw the earliest models of AI, we're screwed. Those were his words. And that was over a decade ago, or just about a decade ago. So AI, we should also point out, I always call it so-called AI. Meredith Broussard calls it artificial unintelligence. What's the other one? Gary Smith calls it the AI delusion. The sort of sentient AI that we saw in like 50s sci-fi films, most serious researchers gave up on that decades ago. The so-called AI we have now are these large language models. And the reason why that's really important is because the bias of AI reflects whatever large language models you put into it. Some of the earliest large language models were testimony from the Enron case. If any of you are old enough to remember that, but suffice it to say, the bias was toward very corporate speak and legalese in the AI generator. So I'm not confident AI is going to be the greatest savior of us. I do think it's an interesting tool that can make some things easier. But deepfakes are one of the difficult challenges when it comes to fake news that we're going to have to deal with in the 21st century. I watched I don't know, didn't you guys watch 30 for 30? What that is? Okay, it's a sports documentary show. And they made a documentary about Al Davis, and I'm blanking on the guy, but then commissioner of the NFL, how they had this big debate about the Raiders moving in the 1970s. But both the commissioner and Al Davis were dead when they made the documentary. So they remade them with AI as talking heads in the documentary. And like at first you knew something was off, but 5 minutes in, I watched a whole 2-hour documentary, never remembering that the two people who are talking to me are dead. It's that powerful, that convincing. There's now also, I was at a conference with Microsoft because I hate myself. And the conference showed some of the new AI tools. And one of the tools was a teacher lecturing on a screen. And then they revealed that she actually wasn't lecturing. The new Microsoft tool used her image, and she was typing on the side what the image of herself was saying. So my point being on these things, and I think Tupac also sang on stage, rock on Cali. These AI-generated images are becoming more and more sophisticated, and it's more and more reason we need to simply suspend judgment. Seeing is not believing anymore. Maybe never was. And I think we have to remember that when we talk about events. And I know this is this sort of got taken the wrong way when I got it published, but there was some debate initially on October 7th about mass sexual assault on during the Hamas attack in Israel on October 7th, 2023, and there was the debate about it. But the debate aside, Biden argued it was true because he had seen a video of it. And I pointed out that like two things could be true. Biden could see a video of it and it could have not happened. Because deep fakes exist. You could show a video of it happening when it did. Not saying that it didn't, not my point. My point is that deep fakes create a new way of us thinking about things. Just because someone says they saw something doesn't mean we need to believe it's true. We're gonna need more evidence. It raises the bar on the evidence that's needed.
So I'm gonna combine two questions because one of them is answering the other. So the question is, do you know of organizations that are doing a good job of encouraging civil discourse? If so, which ones? And then the another person asked about Jubilee's Middle Ground series, and if you know it, and if it's a good example.
I am not familiar with Jubilee's series, but I will write that down. I've got a bunch of recommendations on this trip. Yeah, I think there are some organizations that are trying to do it. We put some of them in the book, and I don't want to butcher their names right now, but I do think there is an effort. One of the things I'm optimistic about is little changes I see in the discourse. Not enough people are changing their behavior, but some people in power are at least starting to talk about this idea of how we need to talk to the other side. And I've seen folks like Bill Maher on Real Time. I've seen some of like the CNN hosts. Even Barack Obama's speech at the DNC convention was very focused on this idea of reaching out to people we disagree with. Michelle Obama emphasized the fact that nobody's perfect. People make mistakes. We need to be open to that idea and discussion. All those people I named, I can also give you tons of cases where they've played to the divisiveness. But the very fact that they feel compelled to say that publicly gives me some hope that they're speaking to something I think they see as a hunger in the larger culture and environment. And I know from being a faculty member, one of my approach to the classroom with these divisive issues, and I teach in a lot of different areas and spaces, and sometimes they're more conservative students or more liberal students. Regardless, I spend my time in the classroom always trying to challenge them on their perspective and trying to needle them to defend their position. And even students who leave the class totally disagreeing with me will consistently say, like, well, we at least like this class. We got to hear different views, In this conservative institution, we never get to hear liberal views, or in this liberal institution, we never get to hear conservative views. And so I think there's also a hunger just amongst young people. Young people are typically, and I would say for sure in this generation, more intuitive to bullshit. They have a better sensory for it. But they're also, I think, looking to a lot of us for spaces for more just real talk. Even if folks disagree, just tell me what the two sides are. I'll figure it out for myself. And so I'm inspired by what I'm hearing from young people and some of the changes I'm starting to see from those in power, at least rhetorically, about reaching out to the other side.
So a question I had matches really well with a question from the audience. And so we hear a lot about, events on campuses where students shout down, yell, protest against speakers. And while that's obviously an exercise of free speech, it's not exactly civil. So An audience member is asking, what strategies have you found to be effective to engage those with opposing viewpoints in discussions that can be open interactions to increase understanding rather than trying to yell loudest or change minds?
Yeah, yelling loud's probably not a good strategy for getting someone on your side. Also with those public talks. I would, if there's a speaker on your campus who you don't think should be a speaker on your campus for whatever reason, right? By the time they get to the campus, I think you've already sort of semi-failed in your job as a participant in campus governance. I would take it up to those who lead the government, or if there's a student club who's supporting it, or a faculty member is supporting it, and understand why they're doing it. Why is this person coming to campus? What is the academic value? What is the value to the community? I would make those folks defend their position. Now, maybe a chance where they're still going to bring these people to campus, and that's fine. It's a free society. If they feel compelled to bring someone to campus and use campus resources, so be it. That's the process we have. But you can also say, like, well, what about if we have like an open Q&A part or a discussion part, so we can at least engage with these folks and ask questions. Like Richard Dawkins was speaking at UC Berkeley, and there was a huge protest to have him not come, and he ended up, there's always a protest at Berkeley, but they had a huge protest to not get him to speak, and he stepped down and decided not to speak. And a lot of us were pretty critical of the decision to kick Dawkins off campus, but it turned out what actually had happened was the students said, no, Dawkins can come to campus, but we want a Q&A portion. We want to be able to ask Dawkins correct questions directly. And Dawkins was the one who said, no, I don't want to deal with the Berkeley mob. And so it was Dawkins who ended up stepping out. But I think trying to make the events more interactive, allow students to feel like their voice is heard, especially since they're the ones paying the tuition dollars. I think that's probably a good step as well.
Another question from the audience is, how do you feel about someone deciding to be apolitical? Can one still be apolitical yet be an activist?
I don't think you can ever be apolitical in a democracy. Everything at some level is political. I could make arguments just about like the clothes you purchase and what companies you buy from is a political statement at some level, or a political act at some level. But to be an activist, you don't need a political party. You don't need a political ideology. Some folks are, one policy, that's it. That's all they care about. And they don't care about red or blue or the election, or they just want this one policy passed. That's fine. Some people take that tack. Other people really believe working within the party system. So they're going to get inside the party and change it from within. We've seen people try that historically as well. A democracy needs all of the above. What's the MSNBC O'Donnell? What's his first name? Lawrence O'Donnell. Lawrence O'Donnell used to work for the Democratic Party, and he one time, about 2006, gave this interview where he said something that a lot of us go back to. And he said, when I was in the Democratic Party, I didn't need to listen to the left, because the left had no power. The left would never vote for Republicans, and they would always turn out and vote for Democrats. So I didn't have to listen to them. I knew that they would go with the Democrats because they feared the Republicans. And his point with that was that to be in a democracy means taking action. It means threatening those in power. So while some people work within the system to try and change the Democratic Party from within, other people work on the outside and say, you're not going to get my vote. I'm not going to show up on election day. And that can be a powerful way to leverage power without being engaged in party politics. So I think there's a lot of ways in which folks can make change. And just one last point on that I want to say, my field of history does a real poor job of this. A lot of history classes teach top-down change, right? We elected the right person. Without LBJ, we never would have had the Civil Rights Act. Without FDR, we never would have had the New Deal. Thank God Woodrow Wilson let women vote. That's not the reality of how history works. Actually, activists on the ground organize. They pressure people in power. They force them to do what they want. That's how you get change. For women voting, for example, Wilson wasn't nice. Wilson was trying to convince the world community to sign on to the League of Nations. He thought he was going to deliver democracy to the world. And while he's bringing world leaders to the White House, women staged a protest and said, like, I don't think he can deliver it to the world because he can't deliver it here in the United States. And Wilson was like, just give them the right to vote, get them off the lawn. They're killing my foreign policy. That's basically what you can do outside of the system. Put pressure on those in power so they give in to your demands. And that doesn't need to be within the party.
So that connects to another question from the audience. Since there are so many interests benefiting from the status quo of fake news and disinformation or news as entertainment, is it only when people protest that any change can occur?
Yes, we have to be active in our democracy. We have to participate in all facets of our democracy. And this creates difficult conversations about strategy and things like that. Like the example I gave a moment ago of not voting, like if you believe in the lesser of two evils of the party, if you not voting for the lesser of two evils because you want to teach them a lesson so they move further to your position, that's not a strategy everybody on your side of the spectrum is going to agree upon. You have to do the work to convince others to engage as well. It takes movement, it takes involvement, it takes engagement. I think that the studies are pretty clear, and I'll cite Christian Fuchs here, that slacktivism or online activism, it rarely does much. At best, online activism can help amplify well-organized existing protest movements, so it can draw people's attention to them and build them a little further. But most of the work still happens on the ground with that organizing and in person. So that's the work that needs to be done, and the internet can help amplify it after those initial stages are done.
How do you think we can overcome the overall distrust of the media?
I don't think it's our job. I think the news media companies, the six major companies that control 90% of news media, they're really responsible for this problem they find themselves in. And this was one of the where I found myself in a weird position, like in 2016. A lot of Donald Trump's critiques of news media, I think, landed with his supporters because they were right. The news media had created major errors. I mean, I'm a product of this. I got into news media because I was a college student and I watched the WMD's farce. So I put my career in being skeptical of media. There wouldn't be folks with that skepticism if media didn't screw up in those moments. So I think it's really on the news media. I think they will never be able to fully get public's faith in them as long as they put profit over truth, which they've done consistently for decades. But outside of those big companies, I think individuals are doing great work. I'm very excited about a lot of these independent journalists who are, writing pieces while also hosting podcasts and creating explainers on like TikTok. I think some of the work they're doing shows a new direction for journalism that could be a way to get more faith in the practice of journalism by following these different folks. But of course, it has its own problems, the lack of editors and gatekeepers, and there's the threat of audience capture. But I think the more people who do great journalism and do great stories that actually help us think about our world in new and different ways and help feed into movements, the better. That'll build more faith in those journalists. And I like to point to an example of citizen journalists too. Don't forget, we all have the ability to participate in the journalistic process. And if you guys were alive in the summer of 2020, you saw the power of citizen journalism. Let's not forget that the murder of George Floyd in most other eras would have just been swept under the rug, no problem. But citizen journalists took videos, they amplified it online, they forced corporate media to talk about it. Corporate media was then forced to talk about it, amplify it online. You saw these huge protest movements throughout that summer. That's what good journalism can do when done correctly. So
there's another question here that you kind of have addressed, but I think the final part could offer some new insight. Don't you think there's a fundamental conflict in media organizations to truth and being profitable? They get more clicks by confirming people's biases and hence more ad revenue. Why would we expect anything different? And so I started thinking about what are some individual acts that we can do to maybe force media to change that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I like the way that in the middle of that question, they had that, why would we expect them to do anything different? I don't expect them to do anything different. They often do put their profit motive over truth. And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to journalists, and it's always off the record. They'll never admit this publicly, but they'll say things like, yeah, you're right. We know there's things we can and can't say, and we just don't say the things we can't say if we want to keep our job. So this is known within the industry. Like if you work at the Washington Post, you know you don't want to go after Amazon, right? Because they're both owned by Jeff Bezos. And then we've seen where people have made mistakes and stepped outside of it, right? In late 1990s, Monsanto it was here in Florida, ran a news channel out here in Florida, and 2 journalists were fired for reporting on abusive practices by Monsanto. So sometimes folks find out the hard way, but I don't expect them to do anything different. But what I do like, and I think this is already a revolutionary act a lot of people are doing probably in this room, they're just turning off legacy media. The audiences are dying. The audiences have been dying since like 2013. They had a huge bump during the Trump years. Trump was great for corporate media. Les Moonves at CBS, before he was Me Too'd, said it may be bad for America, but it's damn good for CBS. Go, Donald, go, was his point about Donald Trump. So those profit motives, I don't expect them to change, but audiences are leaving. CNN lost about half its audience 18 months after Trump left office. They've tried to go into the digital space. Any of you guys remember CNN Plus? Oh God, it's like 5 years in the making, $300 million, and I think it lasted like 4 weeks. They were gonna set up a whole online app that people were gonna buy to get access to the great quality of CNN that you can only find in airports. And it just tanked. No one wanted to sign up and pay money for it. And when it was Chris Licht, I think when he took over, he canceled the plan immediately. So they're trying desperately to get into these internet spaces because they know that's where audiences are, but they're meeting new competition. And this isn't necessarily an advocacy for that competition, but there's a lot of these online news programs that have, as big or sometimes larger audiences than the primetime shows on cable news. That's why when CNN or something goes after Joe Rogan, I think there's a conflict of interest there. You're going after a competitor. And I think that is really clear in a lot of the discourse. And also, Rogan's going after a competitor in CNN. It works both ways. So I think keep turning this stuff off, gravitate toward journalists who are doing good work. I think that'll hopefully send a signal to these news outlets that they need to do a better job. But I also think we need to really deal with the issue of news deserts. We have a lot of portions of this country that nobody is covering. I like to say that to save money in news media, they got rid of international bureaus at first, and they got rid of small bureaus. Then they stopped working on Friday, and they stopped working on the weekends. So God forbid something bad happens in your small community on a Saturday. Ain't nobody paying attention. I think we need to change that. And I would like to see more spending on getting maybe government dollars to fund startup news programs in these news deserts. Inevitably, someone says to me, well, don't you think if government creates news, there's going to be a bias? And I say, well, don't you think corporate money has a bias? Now we see we both have a problem. So I think some money in those spaces might be helpful to create news outlets. And by having more news on the ground, that will let those legacy or bigger news outlets get away with less because we'll have more on the ground reporting and public record to hold them accountable.
So earlier I mentioned that the university is one of the last remaining places where we have potential for civil discourse across difference. And so a question from the audience came in that really connects to that. Can we overcome the current political atmosphere? It would seem from my perspective that people are much more divided on one side of the fence. And so I started thinking like other ways that we can transform events like this and future events to other spaces in our communities.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it starts at the individual level. I would encourage everyone to reflect on what their principles are and do their best to uphold those principles when they go into the public sphere. What I mean by that is you can't be freedom of speech and anti-censorship if you think we should censor sometimes. That's not a principle. You can't be for truth if you think, well, spreading some false information is all right sometimes. That's not a principle when you don't have that. The reason why principles are important is sometimes you end up defending strange bedfellows. I made my early career on critiquing Alex Jones. I listened to hours and hours of Alex Jones. That's why I'm such a depressed person. But that aside, when they tried to censor Alex Jones in digital spaces, I wrote op-eds and wrote letters saying, do not do this. We should not be censoring voices in this country. My principle was more important than my feelings about Alex Jones, even though I will conclude the guy is a lie machine and a great propagandist who described himself in court as not a journalist, but a performance actor. But nonetheless, I believe in the freedom of speech for everyone. I uphold that principle. And so I think having those principles is a key way to change the culture. And then communicating those principles with others as well. That, look, I understand you really want this person or this speech erased, but I think it's a mistake to empower big tech, or I think it's a mistake to empower government to do these things. We'd be wiser to uphold the principle of freedom of speech and instead try and spend our time dispelling the myths that are coming from that individual. And that also means using this space wisely. There are probably debates that we're all aware of in the public sphere that we're just interested in, right? We're like, well, what is the conflict, or what are the multiple sides on that? The university system can be a great place to have that, but that means inviting people to campus that, part of the campus may strongly disagree with, or maybe even be offended by. That's when you got to kick in those principles again and say, like, look, we're having them here to hear them out, but we're also going to ask them questions. We're going to force them to debate with the other side. We want to see so we can learn. That's the whole point of being here in higher education, is to learn, not just get the piece of paper. And so I think taking those kind of principled stances can be a way to change the culture. But if you're willing to compromise your principles, they're not principles at all.
Here's another question from the audience. How can the critical aspect of media literacy prevail in a political and social landscape where anything critical in the literal sense, and especially theoretical sense, is under attack?
Read that for me one more time.
I will show you so you can read it.
Okay. How can the critical aspect of media literacy prevail in a political and social landscape where anything critical in the literal sense, and especially theoretical sense, is under attack? Great question. Let me raise their hand and say whose question that was. Awesome. Well done. No, it's a great question, and higher ed has been under attack for quite some decades, and I want to clarify what I mean by under attack. The concept behind public higher educational institutions are that they're here to serve the public. And traditionally, that has mostly focused on building a knowledge base, building civic engagement, and things like vocational training are a part of that. But it was often a smaller part of the larger mission of higher ed. The idea was you would attain the skills and perspectives by participating in higher ed and in that pursuit of being a better citizen, to be a part of the job market. There has been a really concerted effort from Democrats and Republicans alike to transform higher education to much more vocationally focused. It operates from an ideology that assumes that anything the public does is wasteful, and so it'd be better if it was ran like a private business and we had more private companies as part of the educational process. So when I say attack, that's what I mean. One of the resistance groups are faculty. But we've seen faculty unions also under attack. One of the great successes of those who oppose sort of the original vision for higher ed has been to adjunctify the faculty, create at-will employees. About 2/3 of faculty do not have tenure track jobs across the country. They're easier to fire. Also, they're a little more afraid to be honest and use their academic freedom in the classroom because they're an at-will employee. There's a lot more ways to get rid of them. Now, I'm not here to complain about the treatment of faculty, although if you listen, I can talk. But I hear what I'm going to say about that. I think students are really the ones who suffer. The whole point of academic freedom and having faculty on tenure track is so that they're able to talk about these contentious issues in the classroom without fear of reprisal. And so I think part of the problem your question is getting at is not that faculty aren't intellectually capable of talking about them. They are, and you talk to faculty all the time. I'm amazed at the diversity of views on topics. But in the classroom, there's a chilling effect on them to be very careful. One of the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I work, they've instituted bias reporting. They're encouraging students to report on bias in the classroom. I don't know if these students are well trained to spot bias. Apparently the campus seems to think they are. But regardless, just the idea of bias reporting, or I would argue the Yelp-like evaluations of faculty, I think it sets up a much more adversarial relationship and makes it difficult. The adjunctification makes those critical spaces a lot more difficult to speak about. And then there's another element that I just finished a book with Allison Butler on that I want to raise your attention to, and I try to always tell this to young people. Corporate media, or corporations in general, media companies in particular, have done a great job of getting themselves into the classroom over the last 20 or 30 years. And they do this by giving out free MacBooks, but actually it gets all of the data from the students. All these smart devices are collecting data all the time. Just think, when you hear smart, think surveillance. I think this also contributes to the chilling effect. I find it very weird. I'm in a classroom where my audio could be recorded and used against me. I think students are aware of this, and some students don't want to speak certain viewpoints because they rightly are afraid it'll be used against them. The problem with that is education necessitates mistakes. I need my students to tell me what you think. Tell me why you think that. And if it's wrong, it's okay. That's what we need to talk about. It's called learning in the classroom. And so I think those are some of the factors that are against it. So on the solutions side of it, I think faculty unions need to do a much better job of resisting the corporate top-down speak that we've gotten for the last 30 years in this country. I think students need to demand more tenure-track faculty and more diversity of views in the classroom. Say we want to bring in these contentious issues. We want to see them on our campus. And I think we also need to limit or mitigate the amount of these corporate media tools in the classroom. One of the things I found fascinating in my study is there's very little data to show that all these corporate media digital tools have actually improved learning. So the data-obsessed people who run universities, I'd like to put that on them. Where is the data that says this has improved learning? I know we see things like grade inflation and passing people, but I'm talking about people who actually learned and got out of the university. So I think more pushback on those types of issues are things we could do. Great question.
So there is another question, presumably from a faculty member. In what ways do you recommend professors from different disciplines, not necessarily related to media and journalism, to implement media literacy to their courses?
It depends on the subject, but this is actually a lot of the work I do outside of teaching. I do work at a couple nonprofits where we help teach teachers how to get media literacy in the classroom, and all teachers have way too much work. They don't need something extra on their plate. So I like to work with them individually to answer this question, because I like to say, well, what's this assignment trying to achieve? Here's a media literacy version of it that achieves the same thing, so you don't have to double your work as a faculty member. Everybody kind of clear on that? But it depends. Like something like my wife does a lot of environmental science work, and she will look at narratives about climate change and environment in the media and compare them to what the actual studies are doing, for example, which has been some powerful work. For mathematicians, I mean, God, polling, man, please explain to the public about polling, what it does and what it doesn't do, is a great media literacy lesson that could be used, certainly. Obviously, in the social sciences, there's philosophical debates and things about truth where you could bring in media. But regardless of the discipline, sometimes you can just make assignments. We were talking about this earlier, that you do this in your classes, and I do it as well. I basically took like the essay prompts I used to have for students to write an essay on, and I would switch it. Instead, working groups to make a podcast to answer this prompt. So they're still doing the critical thinking work, still looking at the evidence, still practicing an argumentation. But they're creating it in a different format, a podcast format, which is hugely popular, and a lot of people are communicating in that format. And so it's a good lesson for them, maybe something they'll use down the line in terms of media creation and podcasting and things like that. So I think there's up-teen ways to do this stuff.
So this question kind of connects to some previous questions, and it's about the responsibility and accountability of media for fear-mongering and enticing panic. But there's a fascinating question here. Should they be held more accountable for outcomes, and how do we achieve that?
Oh, the news media?
Yeah.
The answer is yes, they should be held accountable. But the way we hold them accountable, at least in the US system, is to turn them off, not to subscribe to them, not to watch them, not to like them, not to share them. That's the best way we can hold them accountable. Even though I've critiqued a lot of our news media outlets here today, I still wouldn't be for censoring them or government censorship of them or big tech censorship of them. I still believe in their freedom of speech, their right to do what they're doing. But we do have some laws that are on the books, things like defamation and libel. So it's not a free for all. News media can't do anything they want. I think there's some sensible restrictions already in place.
And then the final question the question here is, what era do you believe the political climate was at its peak? I'm assuming they mean like before all this escalation happened. And so maybe you can end with some thoughts on how if that era existed, how do we return to that?
I don't think it existed. There's no other time I want to be alive than 2024 in the United States of America. There are a lot of problems in this country, but God, we have it so much better than the rest of the world, and so much more than historically has been the case. Just the fact that we're in this space right now is revolutionary to a lot of people around the world now and historically. There's a preference to look at the past, and there are some things I think we can take from the past, and maybe some changes shouldn't have been made. But overall, I do believe that society is progressing in positive ways, albeit too slow, in the way it's progressing. And even these eras we look back on fondly, like a lot of folks will talk fondly about the 1950s and 60s and how, the Walter Cronkite era and taking down McCarthy on national television and things like that. But we also had, the Central Intelligence Agency was operating Project Mockingbird, where they're working with journalists to plant false stories in American media. They still do that to a degree today, but nothing like we had back then. So I don't really buy the good old day thesis. I think we're living in the greatest time right now. And like I said, I'm optimistic about where journalism is going. I think legacy media, a lot of it is collapsing. I think some of that is very good. And I see a lot of new ways of approaching journalism rising, like I said, the podcasting space and explainer videos and social media. And I think it's great. I think it's cool that people are taking this public good that is journalism and finding new ways to reach audiences. And so for me, I wouldn't go back any other time. I'm happy to be alive now.
I think that's a perfect end, right? Happy to be alive. So thanks for sharing some time with us, and thanks for the people in the audience. And we look forward to the next event.
Thank you, everyone.